So this is your first update with an annual report from DHCA now that they have the Common Ownership Community Program and it's been in place for a little over a year. And as required, they've given you an annual report. It has a lot of the data that you also ask for and updates. And so I've highlighted some of the updates for you in the memo, but the packet has a full annual report. It also has a copy of the newsletter that they're now putting out, which is really helpful information to the communities, and as well as a monthly report that the Commission is getting from DHCA staff, which I also think is a really useful report because it keeps the Commission constantly informed on data, which I think is one of the issues that we had talked about previous to the transfer of DHCA. So I would just, before I turn it over, I would just say, the big highlight here is there's 1,066 registered COCs, and this is FY18. And so you have a total of 138,548 units, and over 400,000 people are housed in common ownership communities. So we are talking. So we're talking about, a program that interacts with a very large portion of our community. So it is important that you're updated on the activities and what they're seeing. And I think with that, I actually would just turn it over to DHCA to provide the update. The second part on the Tiger team, which is included in the annual report, is DHCA has started to look at these distressed communities, but I also did put in your packet the summary of the OLO report that Council has requested, which is also to look at the sustainability, especially of some of the more affordable COCs. So that's in there as well.
That's great. We help you. It's governance. It's a lot of responsibility, and we are all accountable for how we handle this. So everything that many hours that the Commission has put into this has, I think, reaped tremendous value for our community at large, and for that we are grateful. And DHCA's work in sort of trying to channel all this and help us do the right thing here has been very impressive as well. We know it's been a big lift, and you all have made it happen. So with that, Mr. Snuggs, are you going to present, or Tim, or George?
Yeah.
George wants to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I requested the Tiger team report, and I did it at the behest, I don't know if she's here, of Vicki Vergagni, who has been such an extraordinary...
Vicki isn't here, that's right.
Yeah, I hope she's all right. She's been such an extraordinary champion for these common ownership communities, and we know that both the chair and I have been ringing the bell on a very complex set of circumstances that are not going to be easily resolved, but that really require attention at the federal and state and local levels. We've got a vicious cycle of lending requirements, dilapidated properties, inability of the COCs to collect fees, failure to collect fees leading to further dilapidated properties, inability to keep up with maintenance. There's really, this is really a serious problem. We've had, both the chair and I have raised it with our members of Congress when they've come to, members of the House and Senate when they've been here to visit. We need to have conversations with FHA. We need to have conversations with other government entities that secure mortgages. There's a lot here, but this represents something like 40% of our single-family housing stock, I think. It's a very, very high percentage of our housing stock. So as complicated as this is, it's extraordinarily urgent. It's going to be a long-term challenge. And again, I apologize that traffic made me late, but this is a matter of very, very high significance and importance. So I want to thank the director, Mr. Snuggs, for the efforts he's made to bring CCOC under his ambit and really take these on as significant housing policy issues, because that's exactly what they are, and I look forward to listening to the report.
Go ahead, Mr. Snuggs.
Good morning, Clarence Snuggs, Director, Montgomery County Housing and Community Affairs. I have with me Tim Getzinger, who's Chief of our Budget and Administration, and we have Mark Fine, who's Chair of the CCOC. So I want to just make just a couple of comments just to respond to the ones that you guys made. I think the first thing on my list was complicated. This is a complicated matter. It is complicated. We take it very seriously. It hit my radar when we started looking at the number of common ownership units in the county and how many of those were serving as housing, affordable housing for working class families, and the age of those and some of the challenges that you alluded to just a second ago. So it is something that is serious to us and has been from the very beginning. But it is complicated. There's a lot going on. There is no sort of one version of a common ownership facility. They all have sort of a different personality, different sets of challenges. There's some that are on the verge of going out and others that are doing just fine, thank you, and everything in between. And so we're working to first get we worked, and we'll get part of that in the report that will be alluded to in just a second, a little bit of information on where we have come with the program itself since the transfer, and you'll see some of that in the report, this report, and some of the materials that Tim and Mark will share with you. But I think that there's been a lot of progress made so far since July of 2016 in trying to get our hands around this issue. We've had staff changes that came over. We reached back to Eric and Consumer Protection a number of times to kind of bridge that gap and try to move this forward. But I have to say that this effort sort of turned the corner and really started moving at a pace that I think is right on under the leadership of Mark Fine as chair of the commission. Mark and Mike Burrows are the chair and co-chair, and Mark is in my office almost more than some of my employees are. Not that that's a knock, he's just there a lot. But he's done just about everything that could be done, I believe, in both working with with the commissioners as well as with the public and with our staff, and helping in every effort to move this forward. And we've made a significant amount of progress in all of the areas, from case management to technology to training to organization. All of that has been, we've made a significant amount of progress over the past year or so, and I want to commend both Tim under his leadership. You know that Jay left us for greener pastures, went to Baltimore, and I appealed to Tim to take to lead, to work with the commission, and he agreed to do that and has done a great job. So I just want to, for the record, just want to commend both of them for all of their hard effort in getting us to where we are today over the last a few months. That's been tremendous. I really do appreciate that. You mentioned the Tiger Team, and we did, I called together a task force under the program to help me get my head and hands around this issue of common ownership, in particular to evaluate and identify the at-risk common ownership communities that are out there. As you know from previous discussions, we have a number that we're working with right now to deal with issues that have flared up that we had to react to. That's not the way we want to do that. We want to be more deliberate in our process, and so therefore we're looking to identify those and to understand what those challenges are within that spectrum of facilities that are out there, and try to understand what role the county plays and what role the other players in whether it's a legislative issue or it's a regulatory issue or whatever, financing issue, to better leadership, all of those things. We want to try to better understand that. And I pulled together a task force that includes Vicki, and she's playing a very active role in that, along with a number of other members of the commission that are sitting on this ad hoc task force with me. And we are working we contracted with the University of Maryland, the Smart Growth Center, to help us start the process of digging in and understanding what's really going on. I can tell you that there is not sort of a wealth of information just sitting out there. nationally or locally around common ownership communities and what's going on. We've done literature search. We've pulled in some data to try to get a better sense of that. We're still in the process of working with them. As a matter of fact, later this week we have an update meeting with the staff of the center to come in and brief us on that and talk about next steps as we move this forward. But I think it's important to understand that this is huge, and that it's not easily addressed in the sense of getting to a strategy, a set of strategies. We have a sense of what's going on, but we want to have a better understanding. We're sort of going through this sort of academic triage right now to better understand where the particular facilities are located and at what level of risk they might find themselves in, and then from there, what role we government has in trying to help connect the dots and hopefully get them back to a place of sustainability. So that's where we are with that right now, and I commend the task force members for all of their work. They're very enthusiastic and engaged in that process, and we're hoping to use that energy in a most positive way and moving this forward and giving us a better understanding. From what I can gather, there are bits and pieces that are out there around the country as other jurisdictions have attempted to deal with their common ownership communities, a lot of whom which have faced some of the similar challenges that the ones in Montgomery County have faced with the Great Recession. You mentioned earlier the difficulty with delinquencies on their assessments and how that affects their operating budgets and their ability to deliver the services and support to the institution, which causes things like deferred maintenance and other issues from the leadership perspective. So what we found is that there are bits and pieces all around. Nobody has sort of pulled this all together. I think for better or worse, we're sort of at the head of the pack in trying to find more comprehensive ways and strategies to go at this. We have to because of the sheer number of units and properties and the role that they play in this county when it comes to affordable housing. So I just want you to know that although we don't have final answers, we're just sort of breaking the surface and getting into this. We're committed to it and making sure that we can advance our knowledge, come up with some really good strategies, and move forward with trying to find ways of creating sustainability, and where there is not, identifying alternative strategies that might allow those folks to be able to continue to have quality affordable housing. May not be in a common ownership scenario, but still we want to make sure we deal with that straight on. So
I think that's really great news, and I appreciate how hard it is. I want to make the comment, I'm glad we have the leadership here from Park and Planning, because you're the ones who create this stuff. And I'm not sure there's been follow-up from you guys. It sort of gets handed over. And I don't know the extent to which we have created problems ourselves in a regulatory environment by loading on responsibilities to the private sector in a way that it just makes it more expensive for them to operate. So I hope that is part of the inquiry that you are looking at. Are there changes that we should be considering in how these communities get approved? There may not be too many more, but certainly this is the way of all things with our new urban locations in the home ownership environment. And are we, as a government, creating unaffordable burdens periodically? I think that's something for us to worry about, and to the extent that it's on our plate in terms of establishing policy requirements that increase the cost for home ownership, I think that's something we need to worry about. So I would ask that you're looking at that as well as the other issues that you've identified. And I do hope Park and Planning folks, that you're thinking about this as well. It's easy to say, fine, HOA, common ownership community, go fix it. We'll expect you to manage all this stuff. But is it right, and is it fair, and is it sustainable? I think that's a valid question.
I think that I can say with the greatest amount of confidence that we've had an opportunity to work with planning to get a better understanding from the sort of very beginning, as you alluded to, around the process, as well as a sort of the census of common ownership communities. That was one of the issues, that whether or not we were adequately billing and representing those all of those institutions. And there's a lot that goes on in, sort of flip-flopping as to whether or not a facility is going to be, multifamily rental, or is going to go, common ownership in one way or the other. So I can tell you that planning has been very supportive, and we've engaged them a lot. I think a lot of the challenges that we have especially with older common ownership communities, really sort of stem back to the state, where those facilities are really regulated and sort of born, and how those documents are created by the developer in the very beginning, sort of have created some ongoing problems for the folks that are trying to deal with this on a daily basis. They're not necessarily professionals, depending on the size and the operating budget for the facility. They may or may not have the ability to bring in a professional staff person to help them kind of weed through that. And some of the hurdles that were created in sort of the birth documents of the charter, and that was originally done when those facilities were either converted from multifamily rental into common ownership, or created as such back in the 60s, 70s, and whatever. And so I think a part of what we're learning and we're seeing is some of those sort of in-place challenges that they face, and just trying to work that out and work with providing information and training to folks so that they understand what their responsibilities are, what flexibilities and decisions they have to make. But you got a small volunteers that are trying to be, they're like government. They're trying to run this, and they're the corporate entity at the same time, and they're trying to make this work, and then take care of their families and work at the same time. So it can be very difficult, and we don't want sort of almost sort of in-place hurdles that are preventing this from being able to be the best situation. But sustainability is the number one issue that we're taking a look at. But to answer your question, I think planning has been aware. They've worked well with us, and we encourage that, and we commend it.
That's great. Mr. Leventhal.
Absolutely. So regarding the Tiger team, what is the participation from the private sector, specifically people in the mortgage industry and generally in the lending industry and banking industry and realtors? Do you have participation from private sector people?
What we have, excuse me, what we have at the moment are members of their county staff people, members of the commission, and in the case of Vicki, a former commissioner. What I have is an ad hoc, if you will, task force. I anticipate that this will change as we go forward and it evolves, but for now we have a sort of a tight-knit group that's helping, put the pieces in place. This is going to be a multiple-year process as we move it forward, and we will involve, and we have involved, conversations with other parties, with the FHA and the work that they do as an insurance company to do risk analysis around this, lenders that are involved in approving properties that are Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac approved. We've had conversations with them, and realtors who are challenged with trying to find ways of selling these properties and keeping them in good shape. So we've had those initial conversations with the utilities around the costs that are related to just operations. Right. We've had those conversations, and we have some connections there, but I believe as we move forward out of this initial phase, we will expand and include representatives from the other parts of the industry. Both we have folks that are in management now, that are commissioners, that are part of management, the folks that are owners, unit owners, and we have folks that are that are interested, that are technicians, if you will, that are part of county government that are helping us with this, along with our partnership with University of Maryland. So we're just in the first phase of the process.
I understand. No, I understand. You're doing a literature review. I understand. And you've already said that Montgomery County may be out in front. Thus far, the literature review, based on what you've said, hasn't turned up a lot. Not a lot of other community, at least the journals, the literature isn't showing that there's a lot of innovative approaches to this. So,
there have been different places where they've had situations like in Nevada and in Florida where they've had real issues.
Right.
with common ownership, and here or there, you might find
Right.
in other places where folks have done some things to try to, on the capital side, on the
Yep.
funding side,
Yep.
to try to help out and some
Exactly.
training stuff here or there. But a more comprehensive view of it, I think we're just as far out as anybody else in trying to get our hands around it. So we've done some initial literature review and some initial data gathering
Yep.
to try to build a profile to try to better understand what we have in the county, but we're continuing that effort now.
Very good. So it strikes me that there's a lot of room for innovation as you get deeper into this.
Yes.
And that, as you just mentioned, money's always the issue, capital's always the issue, and yet there's a lot of value in these properties. They're just tied up. And there's value both from the standpoint of the owners, who, if they're still there, there's value from the standpoint of the associations themselves, and there may be the capacity to borrow against a future income stream, if you can make the owners whole so that they're contributing the income stream. And there's also value for the county, to the extent that these properties are better maintained and more livable, then their assessments will go up, and the county will yield revenue, and the county could take, a sort of a tax increment financing approach as well against an improved future income stream. So some creative thinking about how to improve the value of the property from everybody's perspective, the resident/owner, the association/COC, and the county itself all have the capability, I think, through some creative thinking, to raise capital against the promised future increase in value. So that's just some mechanisms that we ought to be looking at.
I think we're looking at all of the tools. We will be looking at all of the tools. TIF is a tool. There are others. I think the two keys are, one, we need to have a facility that is structurally sound. It is within code. It is a safe and affordable place for people to continue to live. And that we need a leadership there that has the ability to run this, both operationally from the budget side, but also from a leadership side, so that it can have a chance at being successful. And so those are two major challenges that we're taking on. And,
Yeah.
and right now we're trying to get us an assessment of where that is, and then we can start looking at what strategy is best suited
Yep.
for that particular community.
Yep, I absolutely recognize those challenges. I referred to them in my beginning remarks, and I'm just glad you're taking it on, because it is such a substantial component of our housing stock, and it's such a substantial component, potentially, of our affordable housing stock. And so then, the fourth area, we got the rental housing study from Park and Planning, which was really an excellent document. And this is related, but not quite the same as that. So when we first asked for the rental housing study, we used to refer to it as the garden apartment study, because you were talking about existing housing that had been around a while, and there was a question of, do you preserve it, do you maintain it, do you replace it, is it the end of its useful life? Well, those questions precisely relate to this type of housing, even though they're not rental housing, it's condos, but they're market affordable, for the most, not in all cases, but certainly they're vastly expensive condos, but they're not the ones that are in distress for the most part. So when we talk about these communities, it's a big part of the affordable housing equation. And then that gets to what is our capacity to invest from the HIF and to utilize right of first refusal and all of those questions as well, because this is, as Montgomery County goes, relatively affordable owner-occupied housing. So that's yet a fourth area where financing could come, because the county itself could invest in these properties. But I understand that there's this whole legal web of barriers in the way, even for the foreclosed properties, that the county can't just go right in, and especially if the previous owner is years in arrears on the condo fees, that's very difficult. That may not be something the county wants to invest in, but neither do we want to just leave, an abandoned or condemned unit. That's not good for anybody. So,
Because the marketability, is key to the success of any common ownership community. And if that goes away because of inability to get insurance or access to Fannie and Freddie, it really does create a tough situation. You're really
Downward
putting
spiral.
people where they're renters in what they thought was a home ownership.
and the whole condo association suffers if you have just one or two condemned or closed units.
Small number, I
Yeah.
think that we did some initial statistics that said just 5% can cause the budget to really be in a difficult situation. So.
Yeah, so I'm leaving. The chair is leaving the county council. So this is something that I hope Mr. Reamer and Ms. McMillan, who will continue to work here, will continue to keep their eye on. I think it's enormously significant and propitious.
It has to stay front and center.
Yeah.
With housing. It's too critical.
Okay. Hans?
Thank you very much. Great discussion, very important topic. I really appreciate the work of my two colleagues on this committee. You have been in the lead raising this issue from the council side, and I've been learning and studying as I go and anticipating that I will need to continue carrying this torch. So thank you for putting it forward, and we always try to pay careful attention when we hear from our residents in these communities. Can you remind me, Linda, when does the OLO study conclude?
I have to find a date for you.
Okay, so it's not imminent as far as you've heard. That'll be very helpful to frame the discussion. And thank you, Director Snuggs, for the review. I don't get a sense from the information that we have today about the number of distressed communities or communities that are, at risk. So it doesn't seem like you have that data set yet, or you just didn't include it in any of these particular materials.
We're still in the investigation phase right now. We don't have definitive numbers. We know anecdotally that they're out there, and we try to deal with them and identify them through code and other ways that when we have that occasion to.
And you could kind of glean from some of the complaint data, right?
We could, yes.
But
that we want to make sure that we do this in a more comprehensive way. That doesn't stop us on the front end from dealing with situations as we come upon them, either through complaints, because some of the units are rental, so we get complaints on the landlord-tenant side, or code goes in and we realize that what's going on in a more comprehensive way. So we deal with that. That is an expensive way to react. We want to be more proactive in both identifying and addressing those. So yes.
Is the University of Maryland National Center for Smart Growth, they're going to help devise data sets, or?
They're going to help us in both investigating best practices as well as identifying various sources of data, which some of the data is data that comes from county government, and also data that comes from other places like FHA, utilities, and other places, and start to put together hopefully a profile, SDAT data, market data that's out there that talks about days on market and turnover, so we can start to get a sense of whether or not values are falling, and how that plays on the overall sustainability of that facility. So they're helping us sort of profile this and start putting data on the wall, and hopefully revealing a picture and starting to help us sort of stratify, where that particular facility is.
Is there like an annual survey for each of the communities or something like that?
We collect some information. I don't know if Tim want to jump in, but we do collect some information when we do the registration. We go through the registration process. We put together what we call a profile.
That's for is that an annual registration?
Annual.
It's an annual?
Annual.
So you have them provide you with certain information?
Yeah, hi there. Tim Getzinger, Chief of Finance and Administration. 2 times a year we collect some information. One is the registration data that Director Snuggs is referring to, but it's just who are the board members, where is it located, and governing documents. And then the other is an annual survey, which is not mandatory, it's voluntary. The survey as it is right now, it asks a lot of questions, and the question for us is whether or not it should be mandatory, kind of like the annual rental survey, in which we get a lot of great data.
Yeah.
And we get it from everywhere. But the first question that we need to know is the data set, and that's what University of Maryland is helping us on.
You
when
build
defining what questions,
Right.
not a ton of questions, but
Right.
the important questions.
What are the important questions? Mark, thank you for your work with the commission. I'd like to invite you to share anything. And
Can we let them present?
Oh, I
And
thought
then
they were-
They haven't.
I'm sorry, I
No,
thought
we
we
haven't
were
had them
through.
present done their presentation.
Okay.
And then,
I interpreted from your comments that we were wrapping up, so.
No, we haven't given them a chance
I
to
apologize.
do their report. So why don't we let them do that, and then council members can follow up with additional questions.
15
Because we've
seconds.
taken half an hour of their time now.
15-second comment.
Please, George, just
Sure.
wrap it up. quick.
If you want a qualitative survey, you could do what a number of us did in the spring, and what Ms. Florine is doing now, which is go door knocking in Montgomery Village. and just take a look at how many boarded up properties there are, and that'll tell you a big part of the story. And in fact, Mr. Humpton, who's the, whatever his title is, Executive Director of the Montgomery Village Foundation Board, is a good resource on these things.
Well, we've been in contact with him.
I know.
We're actually working there on the neighborhood side, doing some work on the ground in communities in the community, and we're looking at some additional financing for some of the folks that have been in their properties for a while to help them possibly redevelop, improve those properties as we go forward. It's sort of at that point. They're 30, 40 years old, and it's time to kind of renew. And so we're looking at that. And I've had a number of conversations with them, and our neighborhood folks are on the ground doing projects, a couple of projects in that community right now.
So, with that, okay, now,
Okay, real quick, because I know that we have a full agenda. I took over from the program around March of this year after Jay left. And obviously, the COC program, three main issues that we're looking at. We're looking at outreach, education, and dispute resolution. What I was focusing on was improved communication, collaboration, and transparency, as well as improved customer service, efficiency in resolving cases, and then also improving the IT and overall operations. There's a lot of information in here. I'm just going to kind of go with some of the high-level items here. So if we look at Circle 5, it demonstrates the composition of the CCOC. There are 8 members from residents, 7 professionals. The chart below that shows who the panel chairs are and the mediators. What I want to highlight from that is prior to only a few months ago, we only had 3 panel chairs and 1 main mediator. And so through a successful ad campaign, Mark, who quite frankly is a superstar, was able to attract all of these new members. And why that is important is we had 103 cases filed this fiscal year, more than any other fiscal year, of which only 56 were resolved. And one of the issues with that is, number one, we had so many cases, and number two, those cases take a little while to go through the process, but we just didn't have the folks able to hear the cases. And now we do. And that is also demonstrated. So there are 13 cases that were filed this fiscal year, 16 were resolved. So we're on the right side of that. More cases are being disposed.
these are volunteers, right?
These are volunteers, exactly.
And
Circle 6, real quick, this is the list of the registered COCs. This is something that we had previously had an issue with, and this is something that we report on a monthly basis. All of this information is available. The raw data is available online. It's published on demand, and so anybody can access this data and do whatever kind of analysis that they want on it.
you think you've got the total numbers?
I think we have 99.9%.
That's good.
There's always one or two that are out there that we'll find. Page Circle 7, MC311 service request. When I took over in March and was sitting in on the April meeting, one of the issues that came up was customer service and how we respond to any kind of inquiries. And so I stressed being able to meet, our MC311 service request. Although it was 76% for the annual success rate, which means we responded within the specific amount of time in which we're supposed to respond to. We actually increased that to 96.1% in the last quarter of FY18, and we're at 99 point something over the first 2 years, or first 2 months of this fiscal year.
Now, to be clear, though, it may be that you're providing information to people. You're not resolving the complaint that they have called about. You're simply getting them the relevant information for where they are in that stage of the process, perhaps?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Page Circle 8 just shows you the types of cases that we are handling. Although we are seeing obviously more architectural and maintenance issues, we are finding that about 25% of the cases that we handled have to do with board governance issues, whether it be elections, failure to call or conduct meetings, improper assessments or fees, or improper rule adoption. And that stresses the importance of education. Mark's going to touch on some of the things that we've done to improve education and getting the word out. Other than that, there are a number of different improvements that we've done and that we've made to it. There's IT improvements in the case management system. We're rolling out a fully digitized platform which links up to our case management system. This is an e-reader. This includes all of the information that you have in front of you right now. It includes includes a number of the cases that are being worked on right now. Everything can
All
be
the
loaded
laws.
on this, and all of the laws. So this is being rolled out to all panel members, all commissioners, and program staff, so that everybody has what they need, at the click of a button. So
Nice.
that's where we are. That's the 5-minute.
Wow. Terrific. Tim? Mark. Thank you, Tim.
Mark Fine, I'm the chairman. As Tim said, the e-readers are all loaded. They're linked to our computer or our laptop, whoever has this. They are encrypted so nobody else can use it. So this is what we're carrying to a hearing or to the meeting. They're touch, so all we have to do if we want something, just press it. I'm now
Nice.
looking at all the laws, state, local, whatever, so if we need to research something, we have it right here. It has a battery life of about 90 days. We can add into it, take out of it, put it back into our computer, so we're not walking around with paper anymore. It's making life a lot better. As far as education is concerned, we're getting a lot more calls for education before it comes into a case. We're probably getting 10 calls a week where an HOA or a condominium is asking us to come out and help. They're needing guidance on something. So commissioners are going out to assist them with any type of an issue. We're just finishing up our rewrite of the director training. Everyone that attends gets the book. This is the actual workbook they have. It leads them to the links to all the videos. The book and the program has been redesigned. The online program will be uploaded as soon as we have the website ready to go. We're redesigning that one. The CCOC website, we're doing some tweaks to it. Once that is ready to go, the new online version will go, so the links to that work. So this is something the board member can take with them. They can write into it whatever you need. We did our last training about 3 weeks ago on the 5th floor at 1401. We had 61 board members there. We have another one scheduled for, I believe it's October the 1st. The new policy is if it is an in-person training, it will be a commissioner and someone else there for the training so that we do not have problems we had before. I know when I visited Mr. Leventhal, I guess it was about 1.5 years ago, we had some questions. We're going to make sure that we know who is trained as far as the in-person. We're linking that now. We're working with IT so that the online and the in-person, we have a list of everybody. We have trained well over 1,400 so far this year. The numbers are inside of here. We have rewritten the Common Ownership Manual. This just came out. We're adding a couple more chapters. It will be uploaded online within the week. There have been a lot of tweaks to this. We're working on the decisions and orders as we speak, so that when somebody has a question about what do I do regarding this and what case is relevant to it, we have up-to-date data on it. We're taking all the decisions and orders and we've now made them searchable. That will be uploaded, so it'll be similar to Westlaw or LexisNexis. We have been working on that for about 3 months now. As you know, we had issues with historical data coming from OCP to DHCA, and we had nothing in the system prior to 2017. We have folks working on that. We've been working with DTS and our internal IT. We have decided we're working currently, we're going back to 2010, getting all the case records out of storage. We're scanning them in. And once we have that done, we'll make a decision if we're going to go back to infinity so that we know what we have, because we need the data.
Sure.
We need to know the cases. But we are working on that. As I said, we have the CCOC library loaded into the readers. We're also going to put that online so that the membership can see it. We have the new 7 panel chairs. They love the readers, the ones that are using them right now. We have to get them in to train them so that they understand how to work it, but so far everything is searchable. We also, when the case comes open and it's ready for attorneys and panel chairs, we'll send a link to everybody so that they can get it at their email and it tracks where they are, so that if the case changes to a different date, it will follow them and send them notices telling them, by the way, just so you know, this is now changed to this date, so that everybody's aware of what's going on. We've had some ups and downs, but it's a lot better. And
It's extraordinary when you think of how far you've all come on all this, moving out of one department into another, all that had to entail, plus putting all this material together and then making it accessible and available. We're catching up big time.
it's been a work of all 15 of the commissioners. In fact, we've been down 4. Tomorrow we'll be up to full complement, but every commissioner here has been doing everything they need to do.
It's been a huge amount of work, and for that, we are very grateful to you. Councilmember Leventhal?
The handheld, the tablet, explain to me who uses that and what's it used for? I see its applicability to many things.
Commissioners use it,
Yeah.
and the panel chairs use it.
During meetings?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It can load our agenda, it'll
Okay.
load everything we need for the meeting, caseload, everything.
Okay.
And then, let's say we're having a panel hearing. I can go into here, pull up the case, and let's say I want to look at 2018-006. This is everything about that case.
Oh, great.
So that the panel now, instead of lugging around copies
Yeah.
of that case, they can simply go through here
Yeah.
and look at everything about that case. They can write on here, they can write their own notes, so if they want to go, I need to ask a question about this, they can write on this, it'll store just for them, so when they're ready to cross-examine, it'll remember it, but it doesn't write anywhere else except for theirs. And it comes out of the case management system. They have access to case management.
Who manufactures those tablets?
I'm sorry?
Who manufactures those tablets?
Sony.
Very nice. That's very good.
Linda, you guys need it for the next council.
And the
right?
planning board.
Yeah.
That's something to look
What a
at.
great way
I
to,
believe Landlord Tenant is working right now on it.
Yeah.
we've never
They're
seen
commissioners.
That's very good. It reminds me of when you go to the doctor now and he's got the
We
electronic.
could
medicine.
volunteer the IT department at DHC.
He or she.
that. They charge us big time.
I also want to commend you, as I wind down here, I can't even remember all the legislation I've sponsored, honestly. And that's a problem because I have to tell other people about these were my accomplishments and I forget. So I'm really happy to see this manual, which arose out of legislation the council passed that I sponsored, which required training. And I'm impressed with this, just skimming through it. It's written in plain English, great vivid examples. I'm just going to read this very briefly here. You're talking about the importance of confidentiality. Those are just basic guidelines for commission members and board, the governing boards of these homeowners associations. During a closed session, Maria learns that her neighbor, George, is not paying his assessments. She immediately calls George to find out why he is behind on paying. Whoops, the information discussed in closed session may not be discussed outside the meeting. That's well written. I don't know who wrote it, but commendation. I mean, this is, I recollect that this legislation was, as
a battle.
with all legislation, was not unanimously welcomed by some of the participants, but I'm seeing the value here, and I'm delighted to see it, you know,
Thank you.
something that you can
We're-
pick up and read and touch.
We appreciate it. We're
I feel very
having
gratified.
A lot of issues where some board members are reluctant.
But I can imagine I mean, this is such a great example. You can immediately see, this isn't the most advisable term, but, you know, busybodies who may indeed violate some basic precepts of a governing body just because nobody ever trained them before. It's really, I'm impressed.
We have,
Well, it's not done in a confrontational way
Yeah,
either. It's
yeah.
just done in a, oh,
we
I'm
actually have,
very gratified to see this.
we've had people from New Jersey, West Virginia, California, Arizona, and I believe New York, visiting the site, looking at the training. In fact, Prince George's County is modeling it.
good, good. Well, you should be getting an award for this. Put yourselves up for that.
It didn't come up in the discussion, but I've been remiss to say I appreciate the support that we've gotten since the program was transferred over. We needed additional resources in order to get to where we
Yeah.
are today. And so we really do appreciate that. That has allowed us to be able to bring on some additional staff members who do this every day. And Mark Anders and F.A. Oluwapo are the two staff members we have, and we're recruiting for another administrative staff person. But they keep it going, and the work of the board, I mean the commission, and our staff has been really what got us here. So I'm really proud of that. I think we've made a lot of progress. There's still some real serious things that we're facing, but we're moving in the right direction.
So it would appear not only that Councilmember Leventhal was right in mandating this training for board and association members, but it appears that Mr. Snuggs and Mr. Leggett were right ultimately in moving CCOC under DHCA's ambit, because this is, of many reports we've heard on CCOC's operations, this one today is by far the most impressive, and having a fresh look and new management, you know, clearly helped. So both of those decisions were opposed by some participants, and, you know, in the long run, it appears we did the right thing, so good for us.
It's a good process.
Yeah, well, we all have lived through this, and, you know, we always try to find the right path, and it isn't easy, and people's concerns are, you know, they're valid concerns about whether they be overlooked in the process, whether they're, as a subset of a big organization, would you be ignored? Would you get the resources that you needed? And you have shown that it was the right decision. So we think, and it certainly seems like it. Hans?
Just want to observe, again, Mark, thank you for your terrific work. And Director Snuggs, you've often commented, whether in the context of renters issues or CCOC issues, that there's no substitute for the engagement of the residents themselves in their self-governance. And, you know, it's a powerful point. And I think we're seeing here the benefit of a very dedicated and effective team at the county-wide CCOC level. And so, you know, as you build this up, we'll be able to hopefully direct that same kind of thinking, success, and energy into those communities where we need to also establish that kind of governance, because perhaps they don't have that as well. But if we can create the template here, then we can succeed with that. So thank you for what you're doing. That leadership that you're providing is just incredible, and to all the members of the commission, it's remarkable.
And as we, you all have enhanced a sense of professionalism for the board members, I think that has got to help them in how they deal with their neighbors within the community. Helping the community people. Now, I'm sure, you know, board members, it's like a little government, and you have to deal with challenging environments and disputes and all that. It's not easy, and having some very clear standards for how those meetings are conducted and what the rules are for the management of these common ownership communities is important for the leadership, but it's also important for everybody else to see, you know, what the rules are why certain decisions have to be handled in a separate way, in a special way. It's often frustrating for people who are not part of the decision-making process to participate in it and possibly to feel that their point has not gotten the mileage that they would like it to have gotten. And this provides a context for those conversations to occur in a very clear fashion, and I think it's a very good message to everyone who's part of these common ownership committees, the 400,000 plus people, that, you know, this is a serious enterprise. There's a lot of shared responsibility, and there are very clear rules for how business needs to be conducted. So, you know, this has been quite the lift. We are very appreciative of your hard work. Linda, did you have more to add here?
No, I think also in the packet was a copy of a newsletter. I think
Yes.
this is another way to communicate with everybody. And when you read it, you know, they've had 2 cases where they've had to look at elections that weren't held correctly. Elections are at the core of how a common ownership community runs. They have a lot of complicated rules around them, which gets back to the board training. I mean, there are a lot of issues that I think people don't always realize when they move into a common ownership community, how many issues there are that they actually have to deal with, even if it's just voting in an election. So there's a lot of really good work that's been going on.
Right, and it's got to give people cause to think back at the governing documents. I saw a dispute going on with respect to weighted voting. That's got to be hard to manage, and for the community to understand that, and for the people who are counting the votes to make that work. Probably well-intended by somebody at some point in time, but the reality of that can be very different, particularly when there's a real dispute where every vote matters. So good luck to you all. We'll turn this over to the next council to bring it on home. So, and we know you're under great leadership right now. Mark.
Just for the record, I'd like to thank the council, Director Tim, and commission and staff for all the help they've given us.
Well, that's terrific, and I want to thank all the board members for the commission and all the volunteer assistance and support that you're getting from so many great professionals. So you are all making a difference. Thank you. All right. For that, we shall move on to a continuation of our meeting from just the other day. Wasn't that Thursday, Mr. Zients?
Just seems like yesterday to me.
It was yesterday, practically. This is
On the 20th.
the resolving the
Thursday.
work on really on the bonus density issues from zoning text amendment 1806. This is all just about the how it applies to Bethesda, correct?
Right, and...
Yeah, so that's the issue before the committee today.
Right, and of course, I did copy the status of the ZTA as amended by the committee in the background, just to make
Yeah.
sure I got everything right. You can correct me.
We hope you did. We're sure you did.
Well, if I don't keep track, I lose track. It's one of those things. And as far as technology goes, I'm delighted that my pen works, as opposed to all the other things.
You may get one of those flat screen.
No, a pen's fine for this. And the sole issue that the committee had not dealt with was how does ZTA 1806 relate to the Bethesda overlay zone? And you'll recall that we had discussion that Bethesda overlay zone is very different with its assessment of density. There is language in there that makes it a little ambiguous on whether the bonus density for MPDUs applies at all, but whatever it says, the council can determine what its intent is with regards to MPDUs and bonus density in Bethesda. What you have on page 3 is some revised text that that says, in the Bethesda overlay zone, if you're 2.5% above the minimum, which is 15%, you then get a one-for-one bonus density for the FAR for MPDUs at the same percentage. So if you provide 1%, if you provide 18% MPDUs, you would get an 18% bonus density. If you provided 16% MPDUs, you would get no bonus density. And the intent is to have some increment above what is required by law in order to get that bonus density.
And that is the distinction that would make Bethesda separate from.
It would make it separate.
Because this law would control, as opposed to more, the overall standard that we're
Correct.
otherwise applying.
This-
Okay, may I ask a question? The language that you have on page 2, where we allude to the calculations of FAR, where MPDUs over 12.5% are exempt from the calculation of FAR. Is that part of the Bethesda?
No, that
That's
is
not.
the standard underlying zone.
So that's what is not applying.
That's correct. What applies, what the Bethesda overlay zone says in particular is that there are only two ways to achieve bonus density. One is density transfers, and the other method is by buying BOS density. So there's only two ways right now that it says you can do particularly.
So in other places, then, you can get bonus density because of the MPDUs,
Because of the
but
underlying,
not in Bethesda.
right,
That's
Bethesda,
the
it's a
difference.
different zone, it's the Bethesda overlay zone.
Right. I do want to say, in practice, we have allowed bonus density for MPDUs in Bethesda after they go above 17.5% bonus density. We've had 2 projects, and only 2, in that category, and both of those were proposing to provide 25% bonus density. We, in essence, interpreted this to be similar to when 12.5 is the base and you started getting density at 15. We interpreted the Bethesda overlay zone to be 15 is the base and you start getting bonus density if you go above 17.5. But the council staff is correct. It's not as crystal clear, it's not well articulated, and this is an opportunity to articulate that and to
Okay,
correct it.
so now I've heard 2 different things. Well, you said the only way you could get bonus density in Bethesda was by purchasing it or density transfer.
That is what the
But I
law
think I have just heard something else.
So that
Gwen,
is
have
what
I
the
heard something
law
else from Gwen?
has written. We think it needs clarification.
Well,
And that's
how do we
what we're
achieve
trying
what
to do.
Gwen has said?
By the language on page 2 of your packet,
Page 3.
I'm sorry, by the language on page 3 of your packet, which is the underlined
What's
number.
proposed? That achieves that.
Yes, it does. It
So then you
clarifies.
can get additional density for affordable units.
With the change, it would be clear.
Okay. That's better than how I understood it to be.
So how much have you provided? Okay, you've provided more at 17.5, but at the moment, the only 2 have been at 25.
Correct. We have not had an
What would happen
application
if
for
an
18%
application wanted to
or
go,
19%.
correct? What do you think
We-
would happen under that scenario?
Well, I can speculate that we would have provided the appropriate amount of density above 17.5.
I mean,
But the reality is, we haven't had that.
but
And we're
a message could
correcting
go
it.
forward could the message go forward that if you want to do a 20% affordable project in Bethesda, that you could come request the same kind of bonus density that this ZTA allows?
No, I think what we're trying to do is say, for
This one
the
with-
rest of the county, there is the chart that we looked at last week. For Bethesda, 15% is the starting point.
I see.
Above
And you've made 17.5
17.5,
the new base in Bethesda.
you begin getting,
That's
Okay,
the only,
clearly begin getting,
that's good, I like that.
which is in essence in accord with our practice for the two cases that we had. It just wasn't stated explicitly. And I think, as the council staff pointed out, if you did a very legalistic reading of the language in the code,
1%.
you might have said, oh, you can't get any density unless you do the Bethesda overlay zone. But we're saying here you can get density for MPDUs. So it corrects something that was a little unclear.
well, this is very helpful, because it had not been clear to me when we left the last meeting that we were going to achieve that opportunity for the production of additional MPDUs in Bethesda, that we were going to exempt Bethesda altogether from that, which appears to be not the case. So that puts my soul at rest in terms of how this is being handled. Now I more fully understand what the staff conversation had been on this point, so thank you. George,
Good. Well, I'm very glad to hear the chair's comments. I was hoping we would
you
not.
were hoping my soul would be at rest.
I hope all of us are at peace and serene. But what I was hoping to avoid was, a big dispute in full council weighing these various equities, all of which we think are important, affordable housing, which probably we think is most important. This conversation brings to my memory our inability to have transfer development rights and building lot termination rights retain their value, because we thought it was such a brainstorm that we would make these we would put these commodities on the market, and then developers would use them in the dense areas. But developers now we're trying to get so many things, and they're all good things. So we want to preserve our ag reserve. We want nice-looking buildings set back from the street. We want parks. We want an attractive area to work and live and play. And we want people to be able to afford to live in that precise area where the jobs are and where the public transportation is. And you only have so much to give away. And that's going to be an ongoing conundrum. I mean, I think today's conversation is not about preserving the land in the AR zone, but that's an ongoing challenge. And trying to, how many tools do you have in your toolbox to mandate an attractive, mixed-use, livable, desirable, affordable community? We don't have that many, and we're right up against it in Bethesda because that's where people want to be. So it's a challenge. So I'm glad we're not debating, based on the chair's comments, I don't intend to, the relative merits of enabling people to live in this highly desirable community and imposing the guidelines and mandates and proffers that make it a highly desirable community. That we're trying to do all these things at once with some success. I mean, Bethesda's pretty nice, but the buildings could be lovelier. I'm delighted with, we were all there, the new United Therapeutics building, which is striking. I mean, it may not be to everybody's taste, but it's different, where we're trying to get interesting architecture that makes an urban area memorable and desirable. To Martine Rothblatt's great credit, she's really invested in that. I don't think we really mandated that of her to get the density. I think she's just...
In fact, it was a no, was that a renovation?
No, it was a partnership because it was county parking garage property, but no, it's really her vision.
Yeah.
And that's very exciting. And I think you'll be very pleased as you see some of the new buildings that are coming online in Bethesda, because I think there is some really very great architecture that is being presented and being built.
Yeah. So anyway, these things are all a conundrum. I mean, we still need a way to preserve value on our agricultural land. We still need a way to, as best as the government can, which is always going to be limited, to ensure that the buildings that are coming online are pleasing. to the residents. I mean, there would be less pushback if there was a sense that once the buildings are up there, Bethesda would look nice, that it would be a desirable place to be. And then we also need to ensure that people can afford to live there. So these are not easy equities to trade the one off for the other, and I'm glad that we're not now apparently going to have a debate about which is more important, affordable housing or design excellence. Because I would have to vote for affordable housing, but the planning board was expressing chagrin that we were unraveling all of the proffers and all of the deals that were made in constructing
I
the
think it's all about
Bethesda overlay
balance.
zone.
Everything is about balance and finding the right balance. And I do believe that the language before you on this particular issue does find that right balance.
Okay, all right, are we okay with this? I think we're in unanimous agreement.
Very
good.
Thanks, everybody.
Good.
Well worth the time it took. Maybe we should have shorter deadlines, Mr. Zines. I believe in short deadlines. Get things,
shorter deadlines.
yeah, get things done.
As I always say, what can I tell you? I've been short all my life. All right.
Indeed. Okay, accessory residential uses.
And forgive the size of the packet. Part of it is due to a report from a summer fellow that went into great research on what accessory apartments are, how accessory apartments are being employed in the rest of the country. It really is very good research. I quoted it somewhat in this paper, but this is a relatively simple issue that the committee agreed to sponsor that does a very simple thing. It takes out the requirement that an accessory apartment need a conditional use to be approved. We have a licensing procedures for most conditional uses. This integrates any problem with that licensing into either an objection that can be made by an opponent or proponent of an application to a finding by DHCA, and this allows for a waiver by the applicant if he thinks that the standards are overly onerous in a particular condition. The hearing the public hearing did have one opponent from the village of Chevy Chase that said, watch out for very small streets and where there was a little exit. Excuse me?
Section 3.
Section 3. I get my Chevy Chases mixed up. There are a whole number of them.
Well, they're not the only ones who have that concern.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's without its controversy. We always have the comments on lack of enforcement of these things when it's left unattended, to the extent that we got that list of alleged violations. They were sent over to DPS to check out, and we do try to do that. They do send inspectors out to do that. But again, relatively, this is a simple ZTA that is more permissive of accessory apartments. The planning staff had two suggestions of relatively minor amendments. One was to delete parking from the list of waivers, and I don't think that is correct, but the other is to make sure that the waiver from distances applied to both attached and detached units was effective. It was a little bit unclear as it was. I think they offered a good, relatively narrow amendment to accomplish that objective.
So what you mean by waiver, just to be clear, is that the hearing examiner would have the authority to waive a requirement of on-site parking or some amount of that, and the distance issue with respect to the separation between units.
Right.
And they would remain as standards.
Right.
You'd have to ask for a waiver. And if there was an objection to that, there would be, then what would happen? Would there be a hearing?
Yes, it goes
There would- then
goes
it would
to
be
the
a
hearing
hearing.
examiner for that.
So that would, where there are community concerns, they can be voiced in that environment.
And if I could just clarify to that point, it's not that that the applicant would have to ask for the waiver, but the opponent would have to object. Is that right, Mr. Zients?
If it was a violation of a standard in the zone, the applicant would have to ask for a waiver.
Well, because it's required to have
otherwise-
off-street parking and have that distance, right?
Right, if I,
So we're not changing that, correct? It's only that.
this is only a
that-
procedural change in terms of eliminating the conditional use process.
Right, again, but we're not changing the law as to the basic expectation. But an applicant can say, I request a waiver from these standards. And so it's on remains the obligation of the applicant to state that somewhere in their application.
But I thought that where Marty was headed with this was to say that if you don't have off-street parking, then you can still go ahead and apply, and if somebody wants to argue that you should not be allowed to have an accessory unit because you don't have off-street parking, they should have to initiate the process. I know.
Well, let's be clear, what does this provide, Jeff? doesn't
The applicant,
say that.
in parking in general, you have to provide one more space than otherwise required by zoning. If that's not available, it would become known in the licensing procedure. Then the applicant would seek a waiver of that condition through the hearing
So the
examiner.
applicant would have to apply. Like, I live in a neighborhood where a lot of people don't have off-street parking at all. Period. They don't comply with anything. So, in those communities, and that's not unusual, in the Down County in particular, where people may have this situation, and it may be a problem for some or it may not, and it's a case-by-case thing. But the applicant would have to would just have to say, I need a waiver.
Right, all this,
So what the chair is saying is something that's not being proposed.
Right, well, this is what, I think this is an important clarification, because the planning board's view, and I thought it was the PHED committee's view, was that we were trying to get to a place where we would minimize the procedural burdens, the administrative burdens on the applicant, and because there's a recognition that in 99 out of 100 cases, there's no problem. And so the planning board had suggested that we would try to get to a point where if there's a neighbor who has an issue, that they would have the burden to the maximum extent that we can, while still preserving the opportunity to object, that they would have the burden of coming forward and saying, hey, this won't work in my neighborhood because there's not enough off-street parking as there is, and they would have the burden of showing that, rather than telling the applicant, you don't have off-street parking, and therefore, we're going to kick you into this hearing examiner process. So I think that's a key detail, that if we could get to that point where you still have the right to object and say, hey, I have very good reason to object to this because I can show you, I took a picture at 6 a.m. before everybody left for work, and you can see that my street is parked up. So you shouldn't allow this accessory dwelling unit. I think that everybody agrees that that's legitimate.
So that's what you advanced in your.
But our position is, and I thought it was consistent with what Marty had said, although I'm trying to, and I'm test whether my understanding is consistent. It sounded like maybe it's not exactly what he had in mind. But what I'm suggesting is that the applicant ought to have to disclose that, and when they notice it and they put up a sign that says, I've applied for an accessory dwelling unit, if you're the neighbor and you say, wait a minute, I don't like that, then you can ask that question go to the hearing examiner for consideration. But we're trying to get to a point where we treat accessory dwelling units as presumptively okay, something in fact that we should encourage. And so it should be truly exceptional when there's a situation that they're not okay. And I'm trying to, and the planning board's trying to get to a point where we have moved we've fundamentally shifted the way we think about this away from, well, only if you jump through every possible hoop, then maybe we'll let you have an accessory dwelling unit, to you should get one until there's somebody comes forward with a darn good reason that's backed up by evidence to show you shouldn't.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure that it is a draconian an issue as you presented. Mr. Grossman, could you just take us through how this, as written, would work?
Yes,
So we understand.
what Casey is suggesting is a actual policy change.
Yes.
And this proposed ZTA and the bill are really just procedural changes to shorten the process, which is unnecessarily long now. It would cut the timing of the process in half. Currently, the zoning ordinance requires an additional parking space, as Jeff mentioned, for an accessory apartment added on. There's no proposal to change that, and therefore, when DHCA looks at the license application, they would have to apply that unless somebody requests a waiver, or in the past, a conditional use application, which is the current law, to either vary from that or from the distance of separation from another accessory apartment. So that's the process now requires that to be done by a conditional use. We're suggesting a procedure which would just combine the current objection process, which is that simple process, with a waiver in lieu of a conditional use, and then they wouldn't have to go to planning department. It would just, the licensing folks would say, sorry, you don't have the required parking space, or you don't have the separation, and here's your option. You can ask for a waiver. They would just file a request for a waiver in our office. Within 30 days, we would have a hearing established. Any neighbor would have an opportunity to object, or the applicant can make his or her case, and then we would decide based on the actual facts in that particular area.
So you would apply, someone would determine that there was an issue. You would say how many parking spaces you have.
Right. And currently,
And then you would put it on, and I'd say, oh, well, I need a waiver. Or could you apply for a waiver at the get-go?
well,
Presumably-
usually the intake is always through Department of Housing and Community Affairs,
So,
license. And so they
Presumably,
would-
someone would say, you need to have this, or you need
their
to ask
intake
for a
person-
waiver.
Their intake person would tell them they would need a waiver because if they
So
don't,
they say, well, I'm applying for a waiver. And so what would happen then is that a 30-day notice period would commence, at which point there would be a hearing?
right, they would file an application with our office for a waiver, or if a neighbor didn't like some decision of the HCA director, they could file an objection. Either way, or both could happen. They would come to our office, we would then set a hearing within 30 days, and it could be postponed if the parties could not make it, but that'd be our initial time period, and we would hold a hearing, due process hearing. Witnesses would be subject to cross-examination and so on, just as under a conditional use process, and then we would render a decision, which could be, and then would have to be followed by a DHCA, and it could be appealed directly to a court.
So that part would kick in. And what you're proposing is really that you file an application, and unless someone objects, there is no hearing. I think that's what you're saying.
Or there's an intermediate position, which the planning board was thinking of when we talked about this, which is even if you require the applicant to go to a hearing in the absence of an objection by neighbor, that they should be, you should shift the burden of proof. So instead, because right now, if you go to the hearing,
I've been waiting to.
I'm sorry, I just want to
Let's finish
clarify,
it.
if you went to the hearing, what is the proof that you have enough parking? Well, that's sort of up to the hearing examiner right now. The hearing examiner could say, I'd like you to hire Wells and Associates to do a study of what the parking situation is on your street. I want a professional engineer to certify that they've assessed the parking situation and documented it. I mean, this is how you do traffic studies, right? That's not what Marty does. Well, that's not what Marty might do, but I'm saying nobody's really sure what the standard would be. So what I'm saying is, why don't we establish that if you have an issue with parking and you're the neighbor, you should have to come forward and establish that there's insufficient parking,
So you would have us eliminate the standard?
or shift the burden.
Well, you can't have it both ways. I mean, there either is a standard or there isn't a standard. I think that's the challenge for us. George?
Well, there's a ZTA and a bill before us, and it says what it says. So I'm trying to understand what it says, because just reading the plain language doesn't actually answer that. So I'm going to state my understanding of what's before us. Please tell me if I'm correct. What we did before, recently, a few years ago, I'm looking at the packet, not long ago, was that we hoped to facilitate more of these accessory apartments, but they were still a conditional use, but the grounds on which the hearing examiner could rule were limited solely to the issue of parking. That's what we did before.
No, that's not exactly correct.
Okay, help me out.
What happened was, it shifted, you shifted to the Department of Housing and Community Affairs the take-in of all the applications
Right.
for licenses for accessory apartments.
Whereas prior, they'd all been special exceptions.
They'd all been,
So everything went through
uses
the
were
hearing
special
examiner in the past.
exceptions.
Right? So the first thing we did was, you apply to DHCA.
Right.
But it's still a conditional use, as of now,
No,
currently.
it only became a conditional use if they didn't meet one or both of two areas. One is that they had adequate parking
Yep.
on site, which meant one additional parking space.
Yes.
Or they were an inadequate distance from another accessory apartment, which depended on the zone, whether it's
Okay,
300 or 500
thank you.
feet. So those were the two situations in which you could apply for a conditional use, which, as I said, is really a waiver. They would then file with, first they'd have to go down to Planning Department, get approval of the application's sufficiency. Then it would come to us, to OZA, where they would file an application for conditional use and pay a fee. And then it would be go back to Planning, where it would take their usual 120 days that they need to do their investigation and go
Sorry,
through.
in all cases, or in cases where you're
Only
not
in those
providing
only in those two instances.
where you're not fulfilling those requirements? where
That's
you're
correct.
Not
Only in
providing
those two.
off-street parking?
Right. The remainder.
Or what's the second one?
The off-street parking or distance separation.
Distance from another accessory apartment. Got it, okay. So only in those circumstances, under current law as it stands now, based on what we did recently, is it a conditional use. So what's before us now takes away the conditional use altogether. However, a neighbor can protest on the grounds of parking.
A neighbor could protest, under the current law, could file an objection to any finding of DHCA director.
Any-
And it would come to us for a hearing, even under the current law. But and now what we've done is said, okay, that's not a bad process, that's worked pretty well, and we do it pretty fast. Let's add a waiver instead of a conditional use, because really that's what
Yes.
that limited conditional use situation was. Because when I say conditional use, it was a modified conditional use, even for those two things. It eliminated all the other standards that are usually applicable to conditional uses.
Yes.
For other kinds of conditional uses. So it was really it was really a waiver anyway.
Okay, and so under the bill in the ZTA that's before the committee right now, which I'm a lead sponsor of, you still have to, you the property owner who wants to put up an accessory apartment, you still have to put a sign in your yard notifying your neighbors that this is pending.
Yes.
How long is it pending in order to test the waters and see if neighbors object? How long do you have to have the sign in your yard?
Until it's resolved. I mean, it would be ordinarily, if DHCA acts on it, I guess within 30 days, it becomes.
Until such time as it's adjudicated by DHCA?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm not understanding the difference between a policy and a procedure. It was the policy to simplify the procedure, and so this ZTA and the bill effectuate that policy. I don't think there really is a difference here, that the effect is the policy. It should be easier and simpler to get these things.
Right, but what Casey is suggesting is an additional policy change in which he would have an assumption that parking is adequate.
But that's not before us.
That's not currently before you.
Okay.
But that's his additional suggestion of a policy change. We don't take a position on the policy per se, but just that it makes sense to limit this as a procedural.
So do my colleagues want to amend this legislation such that the only time parking even comes up is if a neighbor says, once a neighbor says, oh, look, that guy's got a sign in his yard, but I can't park on this street, I object. That's what you're seeking, right? So do we want an amendment to that effect?
Well, that is what they're proposing.
Do we have,
So, may I
Okay,
comment?
that's just an idea, okay.
I'll yield for a comment, but I'd like to retain my time because I have another question.
Well,
I'll yield for a
I
comment on
am
that point.
preparing a ZTA on some of those underlying standards issues, such as parking, distance, lot size.
right.
So
the next council.
personally, I'd recommend, since we didn't advertise for that.
Wait on that.
Wait on that.
For the next council.
This is an important topic area, which is process
Yes.
and removing park and planning, and it's 120-day process from the app.
All right. Could we get, I don't see it in the memo, could we refresh our memory, Mr. Grossman, of since we liberalized the procedure, how many applications, how many objections?
Right.
Could we get those data? And I would recommend that they be included, are they here?
I've actually submitted them. There have been 13 requests for conditional use in the
Yep.
5 years
Yep.
since the changes were made.
Uh-huh.
All of them were only 2 of them were objected to,
Okay.
and all of them were granted with condition.
Okay, so it seems to me that when, I don't know if Sonia Healy's listening right now, when the council passes these 2 measures, that narrative be included in the press release that goes out that says, look, realistically, people are not objecting. I mean, 2 out of 13, 2 of them.
They have
So,
a separate objection process, and I think there have been about 10 objections during that process, which have been litigated, but not part of the conditional use.
but in any event, that fact situation needs to be described for the public. Okay, I'm not quite yet done, I'm almost
just
done,
on that
Madam Chair.
point, but
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about those numbers?
Okay, but
Because
it's so
on the-
hard to get called on in this committee. And I do have another question.
You have ample space to speak, but actually, the memo says only 61% of the applications submitted have been approved. So what you were saying was that more had been approved more recently.
That's submitted to DHCA. So of those folk that started out in this process, that's what the end result was.
They may not have met other standards for accessory apartments that are listed in the legislation. I'm not familiar with that particular statistic, but in terms of what's come to us, to OZA, for either a conditional use or an objection, those are the stats I've given you.
So, Madam Chair, if I may, the point being that we need a clear, plain English description that shows that we experimented with a more liberal set of rules, and it did not yield major community opposition. And that's documented by these numbers. So we need those numbers ideally before we get to full council so we can explain the reason we're doing this is it hasn't been a problem. Okay, so that's my first point. I have another point now. Refresh my memory, please. In my memory, you may only apply for an accessory apartment
Actually true.
on a property where you live.
Correct.
Did we also impose the restriction on who lives in the accessory apartment? The reason I'm asking is because a very valid issue has been raised by a constituent that what would be unfortunate here would be if this worthy effort to increase affordable housing stock ends up instead fostering a whole new market in, I'm going to say Airbnbs, but that's just one company. So what do we do to guard against having, fairly high rent and infrequent or short-term rentals in these accessory apartments? What are the rules there?
Pam Dunn for the record. I think you would then look to see what we did for the short-term residential rental
Yeah.
within the code, and that's where we tried to address how someone would use a separate unit attached to their home. And in that case, we put standards on how many times you could rent it out in a calendar year if you were not at home. So you weren't.
But what if you are at home?
If you are at home, we did not put a limit on that because we had heard testimony from a number of people that live near NIH, BRAC, and those places where they have people come in and stay probably 6-8 weeks at a time with them. And so they might use up all those days, and yet the homeowner's at home. So the idea was really whether somebody was there during the stay or not there during the stay. If you're basically living in the same structure, you tend to oversee the use of that accessory unit in a different way than if you're not.
Okay, well, I do think this is a valid issue. I think we need to be aware of unanticipated consequences. So I just want to pose this as a thought before we move to full council, that I'm the lead sponsor of this legislation. I'm in favor of it. I think we ought to provide more accessory apartments. I'm not 100% persuaded that we should provide even more than we already do opportunities for short-term rentals. I mean, I voted for the short-term rental law, and I don't know if we have any data on how it's working. There is a valid reason to be cautious that the intent of this is to make more housing stock available for people who may not have a down payment, who may not be purchasing property themselves, including, short-term scientists at NIH. I understand that. But the intent is not to attract, high-end tourists from Saudi Arabia or Japan or whatever and drive up the cost of these units. That's not the intent. And so that bears some thought, that if we're going to liberalize it for bona fide homeowners who will benefit from a steady income and elderly folks who are empty nesters and all of the benefits that we talk about for accessory apartments, and we're requiring already that the property owner must reside there, do we want to discuss the tenant in the accessory apartment? How long do they have to stay there? Isn't that a valid issue?
I have to check what we did on short-term rentals on whether you're allowed to do a short-term rental in an accessory.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that.
I'm not certain, but I do know that when you do an accessory apartment, that can be the only rental in your place. You can't rent the accessory apartment and rent the house, or rent another room in the house.
Okay, but still, we're creating these things. We're going to have a separate kitchen. You're going to have a separate entrance. You're going to make it what would, in effect, be a very attractive Airbnb. And are we now creating a market that didn't exist before that is going to drive up housing prices rather than bring them down?
None of that is being done by this.
That market exists, we're not creating it.
This bill doesn't affect any of that, doesn't change any of those standards. It just...
It may be happening, but this is immaterial to it.
It's right, exactly. This just, in effect, takes the planning department out of the process and shortens the process to one that's about...
So if someone was of a mind to carve out part of their home for a short-term rental, it really doesn't matter whether it has a separate entrance or a separate kitchen, except you could make the case that the separate entrance and separate kitchen make it more attractive as a short-term.
Well, I can't answer that. All I'm saying is that this bill and the ZTA do not change any of that.
Yeah, I think Councilmember Leventhal brings up a very good point, which isn't at the moment addressed specifically in the short-term rental legislation. But I think the idea that Councilmember Reamer brought up is that he's thinking of a more holistic bill about accessory apartments, and I think that would be an important element
So this
to
should be something else to be
include
put over.
in that
more
comprehensive amendment. Because it's not really addressed clearly in the short-term rental.
Well, the last point I would make
legislation.
then, and this also will have to go over to the next council, but an accessory apartment must be included, correct me if I'm wrong. Does this accessory apartment legislation before us apply to a separate structure in somebody's yard?
Yes.
That's called a detached accessory apartment, yes. So it does apply to that as well.
Which has a 1 acre minimum lot size?
I can't recall off the top of my head. Pam, do you know that?
For a detached, yes, 1 acre minimum lot size. That's not allowed in the R60, R90, or R20 zone.
Not allowed.
Not as a detached.
Yeah, it's not allowed.
That's the issue.
Yeah.
May I join you now? Or
So anyway, I'll just yield, I'll yield, I'm done. I think that, so fine, for future review by a future council, that's also something you gotta look at. I mean, I've been ringing this bell for years. I couldn't get any attention from the Fed committee chair. There is potential for more units. If you look at tiny homes, other communities are doing them. I understand that we are not doing them in R60 or R90 zones, which is the overwhelming majority of residential Montgomery County. So we're not doing them now. So in the R60 or R90 zones then, which is most of where people live, you have to, it has to be in your house. So that's, so anyway, so for
That's-
future, we won't
this
get
is
to
an
it now,
important
but,
point, if I
right,
may.
I know it's important. I only ever bring up
yeah,
important
well,
points.
A lot of things I want to say here. I don't even know where to. We're in many different threads of this. I strongly agree. This is very valuable housing. This is good housing. We should encourage. This is the only way a lot of people are ever going to get to live in neighborhoods that are proximate to Metro, for example. You know, you look at what's happening in Silver Spring right now, and you have mansionization. It's coming fast, and it won't be long before the entry-level home in East Silver Spring is $800,000, $900,000.
It's that now.
I mean, it's the new construction, now you have in Silver Spring $1.2 million teardowns, like you used to have in East Bethesda. Of course, Bethesda teardowns are now $2.5 million. This is the only way, you know, this and other housing forms like duplexes and quads, this is the only way that you are going to get an affordable housing type built in the future in these communities. So we have to think a little bit more broadly about this and say, of our, you know, we want a supply of this in our overall mix. We need a substantial amount. Los Angeles recently announced a goal to create 100,000 accessory dwelling units in Los Angeles. Now that's thinking big about the housing type and the future. I don't know what the time frame for that is. I'm sure that's a very extended time frame. But that's you know, that's what you do when you flip the whole thing around and say, this is not something we're trying to restrict and fight and oppose. This is something we want to foster and encourage. Now, to Mr. Leventhal's comments, I perceive now that the reason why we haven't had a lot of objections and a lot of litigious battles over these is because people aren't putting in applications in the first place. It's because they don't meet the standards, and they know that if they're going to proceed, they're going to be really in a very risky position to get it approved. So minimum lot size, the distance requirement, the parking. So if you never go forward in the first place, of course you don't result in a lot of hearings and a lot of special exceptions because you just never file it. And I've talked to architects who say, yes, the distance requirement is a killer. You know, you look in communities, Tacoma Park, for example, the distance requirement is probably going to close the door to most of the neighborhoods in Tacoma Park right now. And so you're just not getting applications, whether it's the lot size, the distance requirement, the parking, and there's actually a whole number of other provisions. So we need to look at all of those and identify that, what we think is a strong policy framework for ADUs, and then we'll come back and say, to the extent that we still want to have conditional use, you know, we won't have conditional use, hopefully, because we won't go to the planning board. Kind of amazing that we ever had people have to go to both the planning board and the Board of Appeals. Is that right? You had to do both, right?
They would go to the planning department, not necessarily.
Okay, the planning department, but you had to go through two different entities. That's kind of amazing, you know, that we had that. And we left that in place after we thought we were liberalizing these rules. And I think reality, we didn't liberalize these rules. We thought we were going to. We struck a compromise at the council that we thought was making a change here, but it really didn't. And the numbers speak for themselves. When you look at the amount of units that we're getting on page 3 of the packet, 45 permits issued in 2016 with 1 million people living in this county. You know, it's the same number as my beloved Santa Cruz, California, which only has 64,000 people. So our per capita unit approval is, you know, very, very low. So, you know, it's the underlying rules that we have to address. So I am presently, but I think this bill is very important. I think it's really important to come up with what the desirable framework for when you do have to work out something that is at variance from what the code allows. But we have to actually look at what the code allows and resolve that issue. So that is a more extensive process. I think to be, you know, to have a transparent and fair process, we need to really explain to people this is what we're taking on. You know, and at a time I thought we ought to try to do some of those changes within the CTA, but I just think it's a little bit too much to do this at committee after the public hearing. You know, I think we ought to have a more thorough community engagement process to draft that up.
And I wanted to just say, if that is something that you're moving forward towards this winter, I'd like to volunteer that the planning department would love to help with that community process.
Good idea.
We were very effective in doing it with the short-term rental. I think that
were,
Pam
yeah.
and her team did a great job on that, and we'd be glad to take this on as well.
Thank you. We'll be glad to work with you on that. That's a terrific idea. The last, Marty, do you want to comment?
One last thing I join in Jeff's comment that of the two suggested changes made by the planning department, I agree with him that the one at lines 151, 152 are sensible addition that includes the detached accessory apartments in part of this language. But the ones at line 132, 133 should not be changed to eliminate the language about parking. And in other words, right now,
Policy issue.
well, no, it's that, I'm not sure why they suggested that change, but right now it reads, under section 29-26B, the hearing examiner may grant a waiver from the parking and distance separation standards. That's clearly, I think, what was intended, and I think that they wanted to eliminate the parking and because they felt it was included elsewhere. But I think that would
needs to be included.
create some confusion if you eliminate it.
Sure.
Well, exactly. I mean, as we were having the conversation about this, I thought, boy, I'm having trouble understanding what the process will be. I can't imagine what it's like for a resident. But final point, just sort of related points. A key part of this is finance, and we have to figure out how to create, understandable information and even perhaps public-private partnership around finance, because these units are expensive. It could cost $100,000 or even $200,000 to build one of these. And so, residents need to know what are there community banks that have products that are intended. So that's an important topic area. The last thing I want to say is regarding short-term rental, I think we have to be very careful here, and I think we need to really review this with real estate agents and banks at the table, because my understanding from the book that I just read, and I encourage everyone who's interested in this to read the book called Backdoor Revolution by the Portland policy leader on this issue, if you don't allow accessory dwelling units to be used as short-term rentals, just as you allow the main house to be used, that it has a big effect on the perceived value of the unit, which has a big effect on your ability to get financing to construct it or for it to be valued in the sale.
Well,
so
could I comment on that?
well, sure, when I'm finished. And I think the important thing is to get the unit built, and how Casey might use that unit in the 5 or 10 years that he owns the house is one thing, and then how Hans might use the unit in the 5 or 10 or 20 years that he owns the house after he buys it from Casey is a different thing. Or someone might build it as a short-term rental, and then 2 years later, their aunt moves to town, and now their aunt lives in that unit, or their kids come back from college. So you actually don't know how it is going to be used over time. You might know how it is proposed to be used at that moment, but you have no idea what next year is going to bring, or 5 years, or 10 years. And if you say you can't use it for that purpose, then you won't get a certain number of these units, and you might have an overall effect on the value in the marketplace, which could deter your construction of these units.
We're actually saying the two sides of the very same coin. We're actually saying the two sides of the very same coin. We want property values in Montgomery County to increase because Montgomery County is a great place to live, and, not incidentally, we want the property taxes. Those high property values, that desirability, keeps middle and lower income people from being able to live here. Those are two unavoidable facts. They're inextricable, and they're two sides of the same coin. If the availability of these units, if you can rent them out on a short-term basis to compete with hotel rooms and attract people from out of the area, it will make your property more valuable. That's what you just said, and that's what I just said. It'll make it harder to afford to live there. They're exactly the same statements. They don't contradict each other.
Okay, and so my conclusion of that soliloquy or dialogue is that you want to promote the creation of the unit in the first place. And if you don't have the unit, then you can't subsequently have it rented out at an affordable rate. And if a house is worth a little more because it has a unit, but it now has 2 units instead of 1, that's that's better.
Well,
That's my,
and potentially less affordable.
well, no, because
At
now
the
you
same
have an
time.
ADU. Now you have an accessory dwelling unit, and you didn't have one before. But anyway, this is a crucial topic, and I think it's one that we should get the benefit of people who.
Yeah, I think you need some analysis on the issue of
Exactly.
short-term
We need
rentals.
some analysis of-
I understand that may not be feasible in time before October 31st, that our window to pass
And
that.
my recollection is we did not allow the short-term rental of ADUs.
Is that right?
That's
Is
what
that
I
correct?
think too.
Is that correct? I asked about
I have
that.
to check on the short-term licensing.
Yeah, you can't have both an accessory unit and an Airbnb.
Two separate units.
No, he's
can't get a
saying you
short-term
can't have
license.
both.
You cannot
He's
have,
saying no, you can't do
you
it.
can't do it. Oh, well, that's the end of that. Oh, okay.
It's the end of it presently, I think.
Yeah, okay, fine.
It's
But
one of the
under
topics-
current law, you can't do it. Well, that actually answers my question. And whatever the council chooses to do in future, it'll choose to do.
One other quick point to make, the size limitation of 1,200 square feet, that is a restriction right now. You're asking why folks in applications drop out, that's one of the things. It's a hard and fast rule, it's measured by the outside of the property, it's not actually habitable space, which is something that we moved from. The old Class 1, it used to be like 1,200 square feet habitable. Now it's just the measurement from the outside, and that is something that's coming up.
That's a good one. That's an important one. And I understand that, the recommendation here from advocates is if you want to have units where, a family might be able to live with a child or two, that 1,200 feet of living space is essential. If you have it less than that, people just won't, it's not enough room and they won't rent. So
Okay?
that's another one for the subsequent legislation.
George, you have more to say?
No, not at this time, no.
Okay. Look, good luck. You're never going to solve all the possibilities. And that is the problem with these regulatory schemes. We assume there's a built-in problem. And that's why we add all these constraints. Are they real? I don't think so, mostly. There are some places where these are challenges, to be sure. But I would urge the next council to think differently about this stuff. We worry so much about the one case that might not comply with the rules and thereby exclude the 100 other cases that completely comply. Look, these are ways for people to stay in their homes. And if they can get revenue from it one way or the other, I don't know that the government needs to care about it. Why are we so bothered by this? These are legitimate concerns. You got to be a little bold about this and accept that some folks will be worried. There are some neighborhoods that are in a certain amount of distress. Those neighborhoods are also affordable and accessible to more people. And these are all trade-offs. I don't particularly share all the views that have been stated here, but I do think that this is as good as we're going to get for this moment in time. Mr. Grossman, I was asked to ask you about the number of cases where you see this as an expensive process for the applicant. Are there, in the cases that you see, do you see a lot of lawyers and consultants required to be employed?
No, and in fact, I can't recall in recent times a lawyer or a consultant being involved in any of these hearings, whether it was objection or one of the conditional use.
So it's pretty much neighbor to neighbor kind of thing.
Right, also
I give the floor for a second
Yeah,
here.
what happens is we have one of the DHCA housing inspectors comes in and
take a look.
testifies about the parking situation and about other factors that may not be compliant. But that's what happens in those hearings. It's not an expert-controlled situation. And we hear from the neighbors and get a sense.
So getting back to where we started, so that you're saying you do not see this as a hugely expensive process in terms of, I mean, there may be internal changes that need to be made, but in terms of hiring outside folks to help people through the process.
No, and also we don't charge a fee for an objection, and I presume there's no proposed fee for a waiver either. There is a condition.
So under this, if you apply for a waiver, you say, I want to please approve this. I don't have the on-site parking, but it'll be okay. Does that require the department to send out someone to go look at it? Or if there's no objection, do you even have to go beyond that?
DHCA has somebody look.
Why? Do they have to do that if there's no objection?
Yeah, well, currently they would.
But do they have to? Is it required by law?
They have to make a finding that they meet the standards for the license, which is.
Well, if you've been asked for a waiver and no one objects, does DHCA have to go out and look?
I think they have to go out and look under the current law because they have to make sure there's compliance with all the other requirements for an accessory apartment.
Would that-
The size, the, you know.
Well, do you do that under any circumstance?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so that's standard for everybody. That's no different from any other application. Okay. All right. So with all that said, we wish Mr. Reamer luck, and we'll work together on that.
And you're okay with that?
I think we're okay with this as proposed. We understand what the planning board chair has suggested.
With that one amendment?
The one that you agree is appropriate.
Okay.
Okay.
That was the one Casey was asking about?
No, it's
This
the
is
one
that
having to do with the
allows,
word.
For a waiver from both attached
parking.
and detached units.
So we're no longer seeking an
We're
amendment
not
from
doing
planning
that.
board.
Correct.
That'll be taken up
We're-
in Mr. Reamer's comprehensive review of the topic in the future.
Yes,
With a
okay.
new group of council members.
Now, then we have the next one that's related, licensing. It's really the same thing, isn't it?
Well,
No?
number one, if the council approves this, they must approve some
next-
change to the other code that allows the authority for a waiver. So you have to now approve the bill in some form. Now, I went through a couple of the particulars. I mean, the most basic thing is it allows waiver as a piece of authority. It also slightly changes the time limits. Right now, there's a requirement for notifying people of an objection within 5 days. This will change it to 10 days. The hearing currently is required to be within 20 days. This would allow it within 30 days.
Why are we doing that?
Mr. Grossman is here to explain why.
On the change in the notice time, we found that within 5 days, it was almost impossible to reach people in time to make sure that we were setting up dates that were convenient, so we ended up having to change them again. If we have 10 days to issue the notice, it gives us...
Administratively, you just couldn't...
Right, and for the hearing, the same kind of thing, to let people, give them a little more time. There's generally a time on our calendar to do it, it's just, it's giving the time to accommodate people, so. And we also made one other technical change, that is if there are both objections and waivers, that we had time to join them together and have it as one hearing.
Yeah, that is just only logical to do.
Right.
Okay. So this is all consistent.
Good work.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. I think we're good with that?
Approved, Rio?
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Good meeting.
I don't know if any of you have seen the new HOC building at Chevy Chase Lake, but we had dinner with HOC there the other day, and I really highly recommend that you go check it out.
Cool.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I've seen it under construction.
Yeah, those are the signs for the 1.3 million units.
Okay.
It's an expensive neighborhood.
It is an expensive neighborhood, and it looks like a luxury.
Yeah.
You would never.
You would
I don't know what it is. It's pretty high. It's pretty high, yeah. And also, if you go to the roof deck, you can see the question going on.